Hey, what's up everyone? Today we're gonna walk through how I recorded and designed the sound for this crossbow from the game Hunt Showdown. As you can see in the picture, this crossbow got this rugged medieval metal frame, gritty and heavy looking. Now, obviously, I love to have access to a real medieval crossbow to record the actual mechanic, but unfortunately I don't. And the modern crossbow are built totally different. They use lighter materials and pulley system, which just don't have the same characters. So instead, we're gonna recreate everything from scratch using household object. Okay, so after I recorded all the Foley sound, I'll be honest, I didn't have a clear idea yet what each sound would be used for. The plan was just to capture a bunch of texture and see what inspiration would strike. Sometimes you don't really know until you really sit down and playing with it. So let's move on to the utility knife recording. First, I'll play you the raw recording straight out of the mic, no processing. As you can hear, there are quite a bit of room noise in the background. Definitely not something that we want in the final sound. So the first I did was to clean up the audio. I started with spectral denoise and let it learn the background environment first. And once it had the profile of the noise, I applied the reduction, and that already gave me a cleaner foundation. And after that, I added a de-reverb pass because I could still hear a little bit reverb in my room, those subtle room tails. And finally, I run it through the RX11 decrackle because there were some tiny little crackling artifacts in the original recording. So right after that, I apply some EQ adjustment, mainly just a high pass filter to clean up the low end, stuff like the room hum or the mic rumble that I don't really need in the final sound. So with these four plugins, let's take a listen to how it sounds now. Much better. A lot of those background noise and the room tone is gone, and now we are left with something that a lot more cleaner and more usable. And at this point, I started thinking about what I could actually use this recording for. As I was listening to it, I thought this could work really well for some of those hands-on metal moment in the crossbow animation, like when the character is handling or grabbing the body of the weapon. The crossbow that we are designing for has a very metal-heavy frame, and the utility knife I recorded has that solid metallic edge and casing, and the way it clicks and resonates fits in the same ballpark as what I imagine a real metal crossbow will sounds like. So that's what I was planning to use this sound for, to give weight and detail to those little physical interaction with the weapon. So first up, I apply the Oxford Inflator, one of my go-to plugin for this kind of work. It's great for adding perceived loudness and fullness without squashing the dynamic too much. It just gives the sound a bit more weight and presence, which is exactly what I needed here. After that, I threw on the Sound Toy Decapitator, dialed in to emphasize more of the mid-range frequency. The raw utility knife sound felt a bit small and thin, especially when compared to the size and weight of the crossbow. So I really wanted to give a more body and grit to make it feel like it belongs to that heavier metallic world. Finally, I add some compression to bring the whole thing under control, just to tighten the dynamic and keep it sitting evenly in the mix. Alright, so now with all the effects applied, let's have a listen. And yeah, to me, this feels like it's at a solid working level. The sound has more weight, it's cleaner. Now, the way I like to work is this. Once I get a first pass that feels right, I'll go ahead and bounce it out because I want to lock it in, the first processed chain as kind of the guideline and foundation. And this version of the sound become my base layer for anything related to metal frame handling for this animation. So once I bounce that out, I can go back and further edit or shape copies of it to fit more a specific action. Either it's a grab or drag or slight impact, but they all still feel connected because they come from the same source. Alright, now let's move on to some more specific use cases. After I bounced out the first process version, I realized I want to add a sound for when the character grabbed the metal frame of the crossbow. I found a section in that bounce that feels like it could work. Let's take a listen to it dry with no effects applied. And to me, right now, it still sounds a bit thin and small, not quite heavy enough to sell the feeling of grabbing a large, solid crossbow. So first, I added some compression to make more even and controlled, and then I pitch it down. I think just a few semitones to give it more grit and weight. Let's listen to it with just those two effects. Yeah, already it feels a lot heavier. Next, I added another incident of Oxford inflator. Again, it's one of my favorite tool for adding density and presence without killing the dynamic. Along with that, I use fat filter satin for some saturation to help beef up the body even more. Now with all that on, let's take a listen. This is much closer to the kind of impact and mass I was looking for. I applied it right here in the animation. You can see where it lines up. Now, for the third round of adjustment, I'll first disable all the third layer effects so you can hear what it sounds like right off a second round. It's basically the same sound, just a bit louder. Even at this stage, I feel the attack was a little bit too sharp when you compare to the image. For grabbing action, I don't need a hard transient. It should feel more like a firm hold, not a sharp hit. So I used a transient shaper to dial back the attack, and that immediately made it feel like you are grabbing something solid rather than tapping it. Then, yes, another inflator. I follow that with some saturation and then an EQ adjustment. This time, a low pass filter to roll off the high end. I was still hearing that utility knife high frequency ringing, and it didn't feel right in the context of this interaction. After that, I add a recenter plugin just to make sure that the stereo image stay in the center and didn't drift too much in the mix. Now, with all the effects chained together, let's listen. Yeah, now it really feels like someone is grabbing onto a heavy crossbow. There is still a bit of plasticky texture in there, but honestly, I kind of like it. In sound design for games, you are not always aiming for pure realism. Sometimes it's more about what feels satisfying to the ear. But I did still want to bring back a little bit metallic character, so I add a convolution reverb and send it to simulate that. Now, most people think of the convolution reverb as a way to add space and ambience, but you can also use it to add material resonance. In this case, I used Melda Production Convolution Reverb, which includes some great sound design impulse response. For this, I picked a preset set called Iron Gate, which adds just a right amount of metallic texture to the sound that I like. Let me take a listen to the before and after. Yeah, that definitely brings it to life and ties it all back to the crossbow's metal frame. Since I really like this sound, what I left to do is to align the sound to the picture. All right, next up, the dog rubber ball recording. And this one I actually recorded with a purpose already in mind. I want to use it for the string tension sound during the crossbow reload. To really sell that stretching and strained feel, let's listen to the raw recording first, no processing. Same deal as before, I cleaned it up with the spectral denoise and de-reverb just to get rid of the room tone and the background noise. And once I got it sound clean, I bounce it out to lock it in. And now let's jump into the bounced version and show you what I did. Right now, it's got a really gritty texture, and the timing of the stretch already feels like a good fit, but the tone still sounds too much like a rubber, not quite like a metal string under a tension. So the goal here is to reshape the texture to feel more like a heavy crossbow string. The first thing that I did was add some saturation. I used Oxford Inflator and Fat Filter Saturn 2 to give a bit more grit and body. And then I made some EQ adjustment and add multiband compression, mainly just clean up the low and high end. I didn't need any of that excess rumble or high end fuzz for this sound. With just those effects applied, let's take a listen. Definitely sounding better, fuller, and a bit more aggressive, but the texture still feel too rubbery. So here's where I got a little more experimental. I loaded up a granular synthesizer from the Melda production, and this plugin is super powerful. So I used one of the reverb style preset, but this is not a traditional reverb. It's a granular synthesizer that can simulate the reverb effect by chopping up the audio, rearrange it. And what I love about this is that I can focus the effects on a specific frequency. And for this one, I targeted the mid frequency to really sculpt the core of the stretch. So let's check it out with this setting applied. So as you can hear, the sound is now starting to feel more like a stretched string under tension and less like a rubber. And that plasticky bounce is mostly gone. And we are getting closer to that tight and metallic pull I was aiming for. And after the granular sense, I noticed that there are some frequency got introduced into the mix. So I add some EQ and multiband compression to clean up a few leftover frequencies, especially around 10K, which still has some harshness I didn't want. And then I finish it off with a limiter just to give a whole thing a bit of a boost. And now with the full chain applied, let's take a listen. Yeah, this is getting much closer to what I had in mind for crossbow string tension sound. And after getting that processed stretch sound, I picked a couple sections that felt a good fit with the animation. So I dropped them into the sub project where I actually sense everything to picture. So I layered the sound intentionally based on how I imagine the crossbow will actually feel to load. That first moment when you just start pulling should be the most gritty and resistant. Then the middle moves a little bit faster and smoother, and finally it dies off as the tension settles. So I arranged the layer to reflect the shape, heavy at the start and looser at the end. I also applied a few more saturation and exciter effects on those layers to help them stand out in the mix, just enough to give them some edge without overwhelming the natural feel. All of those layers are grouped into a folder, and on that folder, apply some EQ, imager adjustment, and more exciter processing to help the sound cut through. One plugin I love using here is the entropy EQ. It's super powerful. It has this entropy dial that help bring forward specific frequency in the sound without over processing it or making the sounds artificial. You can dial in the transient and tone balance with a lot of control, which is perfect for detailed texture like this. I also use the decapitator and the radiator, both for adding that gritty warmth and harmonic excitement, helping the stretch feel more aggressive. Now, after stacking all of these, I noticed I had introduced a bit of noise into the mix, so I add a denoise pass to clean things up again, followed by another EQ and some transient shaping to smooth out the harshness and reduce the attack slightly for better transient between sound. And finally, add a bit compression to even it out. Let's take a listen now with everything except the convolution reverb. It's definitely start to sounding more fit to the picture. It gave that tight and strained tension I was aiming for, but to me, it still felt like it was missing some metallic resonance because the string is actually connected to the metal frame, so I needed more connection to the metal frame sound. So just like I did with the frame grabbing sound, I sent this to a convolution reverb using an impulse that adds a nice metallic body to the whole stretch. And since the string is physically attached to the metal frame, I feel that metal resonance was very essential. So let's hear it now with the convolution reverb added. Now let's move on to some smaller detail like the trigger pull and a few mechanic click I recorded. For the trigger sound, I actually used the utility knife again, and this time focusing more on its mechanical parts, like the sliding click and the way it hits the metal casing. I was aiming for something small and mechanic, but still with a bit of weight. So same starting process as before. I cleaned up the recording with the denoise and de-reverb, then added some saturation for characters. So for this one, I also used the frequency shifter to slightly dual the high. So that's the bit I used right here in the project as the trigger pull sound. I add a limiter, but just for the gain reduction, not to squash it. It's just to control the level, then some compression to smooth it out, and a transient shaper to soften the attack. Since it's a trigger sound, I didn't want it to be too snappy or aggressive, just a small controlled mechanic click. And that's what I ended up with. It's simple, it fits to the moment, and it doesn't distract, so I left it as it is. Alright, now let's move on to the arrow whoosh. So for this, I recorded the sound of swinging piece of cookware. Same starting process as usual. I cleaned it up with denoise, de-reverb, followed by some EQ to temp the room tone. Then I added the Oxford inflator, and this time I used Filter Freak to help shape the sound, giving it a bit of that filtered wind resonance, like the arrow is cutting through the air. I layered in another round of saturation to add body, and then used the entropy EQ again. As I mentioned, this plugin is great. Next, I added a limiter to control the dynamic, a flanger to give the sound subtle motion, and even serum effects patch, using the hyperdimension to give more movement and more width. Then I applied a multiband compressor to shape the frequency spectrum across the full sound. Let's hear it dry, no processing. And doesn't sound much like an arrow yet. Now here's the same recording with all the effects applied. Now we're getting closer. From there, I picked the section that felt right, bounced it out, and brought it into the picture. First, I slowed the clip down by half, and that helped match with the motion of the arrow in the footage. And quick note, I originally recorded at this 96 kilohertz, which would give me more detail when slowing things down, but my system couldn't handle it, so I switched it back to 48 kilohertz, which still works fine for this case. Just something to keep in mind. Higher sample rate help preserve clarity when stretching audios. Notice there's a low end bump at the beginning, so I used the multiband compression to control that, plus a bit of pitch shifting to adjust the tone. Then I automated the filter frequency sweep to simulate how the air tone change as the arrow travels, and that gives more of that classic whoosh movement. Finally, some extra EQ cleanup and a last pass of multiband compression to glue everything together. And one more thing I want to talk about is how I layer the sound, especially for the trigger pull moment when the arrow fires out of the crossbow. So for a moment like this, whether it's gunshot, explosion, or some big impact, exciting moment, I have learned from other sound designers that you don't always want to stack all the sound on the exact same rate. If you line it up every layer right on the top of each other, it can actually make the movement sound muddy and overly dense or even distorted. You got one massive transient but no definition. So instead, a better approach is to slightly offset the layers, spread out the transient just a few milliseconds apart, and that way you create bursts of energy made of multiple components, each with its own space. The result feels more powerful and textured without being overwhelming or being noisy. So let me show you what I mean. Here is what it sounds like when I stock everything at the same point. Yeah, it's loud, but it's also kind of blurry and hard to distinguish what's happening. Now let's go back to how I originally had it layered, with each sound placed slightly apart. This version feels sharper and more defined. You can actually hear the different texture working together, and it still delivers same impact, just with a lot more clarity. And that's pretty much it. And that's how I put together the crossbow sound for Hunt Showdown using nothing but house stuff. This wasn't the cleanest setup, ton of reverb, background noise, but I made it work. I also learned a lot in the process. And if you made it this far, thanks for hanging out. Hope it was fun or at least gave you some ideas. See you in the next one. Thank you.